Hello everyone, today we talk about the Carthaginian army organization. Up to this point we actually spoke a few about Carthaginians, and we have never touched actually many issues, especially about tactics that are some of the most fascinating in the history of Hellenistic warfare, because this is actually this word that the Carthaginians, but not being Hellenistic properly meant, but they fit in terms of military culture, in part also Rome. In practice, we have explained this time, but we can address much of this from the army organization. So we will actually look at tactics on another occasion, but today we will definitely have to explain also why the Carthaginians had the army they had, and how and why they used it in a way. It's naturally covering political and social aspects of the Carthaginian history, about which actually we also don't know very much. To tell it all, right? The Carthaginians were wiped out in a moment in which Rome still was, in the path of acculturation from a literary point of view. We have this brilliant, beautiful account of the Punic Wars by Polybius that we thank with all of our heart for having documented a theater that otherwise would have remained largely unknown. This is how scanty actually our ancient history sources really are, right? We are incredibly lucky, that we even have this stuff, and naturally, the Western historiography broadly meant at the time was already a thing that really looked at more of a logical, rational approach and critical inquiry of the of the events, and we are looking at a cultured civilization that hasn't left properly a voice of its own, right? The Carthaginians belong to this Chamitic, part also Semitic background. As you know, Carthage was the largest of the Phoenician cities in Africa, right, dominating the other Phoenician settlements of Africa, Sicily, and Spain at this time, because actually at this time we will talk about essentially the Carthaginian history from the end of the 4th century BC to the end in the second, and naturally there is something also about previous times that is different, as as we will see. Carthage actually matured the characters for which it's mostly famous, from a military historical point of view, pretty late in time, right? The Hellenistic teaching arrived in Africa relatively late, right, with the first Punic War actually, before which, for example, the Carthaginians didn't even use elephants in warfare, right, and that's kind of more iconic, like an element of the Carthaginian army. Well, it wasn't like that before, and actually looking at the whole arc of Carthaginian warfare really makes you observe a very interesting transformation, how essentially an Assyrian-style military system was brought by the Phoenicians in North Africa, eventually transformed into something else. But naturally, one of the most fascinating aspects of Carthage is definitely this combinatory capability of military resources drawn basically as mercenaries from all over the Western Mediterranean, that we'll analyze in a while. The Romans called the Carthaginians Poini, hence the Phoenicians in our tongue, and Punic Wars, of course, as well. And Carthage was essentially a commercial and naval power, right? The military system of the city wasn't actually very developed by itself. They hired mercenaries most of the times, right? As we will see now, this is not completely, this is not the totality of cases, but definitely Carthage didn't develop into in properly a militarized society as, for example, the Roman one, where actually all the freemen were brought to fight and were framed under a specific training and starting to become a professional militia actually not even since Marius, but since the Second Punic War, and even in there naturally triggering certain dynamics of Roman societies that, however, in Carthage had partly already happened, because Carthage was fundamentally an oligarchy of great estate owners, like great landowners, and there was all this mass proletariat at the bottom of society that was, by the way, also quite risky for the same elite, because when you have an army of mercenaries, it doesn't take much of a to imagine to just take power with the support of this unhappy proletariat and rule Carthage fundamentally as a kingdom. So for this reason, for example, the Carthaginian officers were all aristocratic, right? This is something different in Rome, for example. It also depends what it means by aristocratic, actually. But you understand that there were actually different systems. Polybius draws this ideal parallelism for which the full functionality of the Carthaginian system was somewhat, reached its apex shortly before the basically the Punic Wars, or even the first part, and then Rome basically reached its acme in the Second Punic War, and explaining thus the if you want a mechanicistic approach to the transformation of these systems that actually were quite different, and that, however, seen as twins, right? At least in these clash for the dominance over the Western Mediterranean, that was a big deal. Naturally, you can't think of Rome and Carthage in those terms. They had even been allies previous to the Punic Wars. So Carthaginian generals were elected, right? Probably by the Senate, possibly confirmed by a popular assembly or something. But the interesting aspect of it is that the Carthaginian generals sometimes had basically a command for life, right? Except in the case where actually condemned to death, as we'll see now, for failure, right? And as far as I know, probably there were certain few military clans within Carthage that were specifically militarily oriented. This is perhaps a speculation, but definitely Carthaginian political life wasn't particularly easy. As far as we can see, there were certain tensions, certain changes. For example, the Barca clan belonged to a newer group that wanted, it was more reformistic in mind, had less oligarchic view of power, also for an expansion of, say, Carthaginian military system. These are very important. I mean, at least in creating properly a military class, right, of local levies that were not just, in fact, militia, but something more advanced. Because this was a problem for Carthage, but definitely the other clans were not very, that were in favor of oligarchy, were not very fond of this idea. And the Carthaginians, as we were saying before, often punished their own generals, right? Sometimes to the extent of crucifying them, right? To show as example for the others. And mercenary troops were generally under officers of their own nationalities, albeit, as we've seen before, the Carthaginian army as a whole was, rigidly framed within the Phoenician guidance, and there is just the case of Xanthippus of Spartan that seems to have risen to a higher command, to the high command, and in that case, in a situation of emergency that threatened Carthage from annihilation. About that there would be a lot to talk, because Xanthippus is credited to have introduced in Carthage the Hellenistic military thinking. This not erroneously, as many people think that the Carthaginians copied things like the Macedonian phalanx. That's a mistake I found somewhere, sometimes even among scholars, improper translations that make them think the Carthaginians fought like. There is this idea that in order to to embrace Hellenistic military thinking, you have to fight either like a Macedonian or a Greek. It doesn't function like that. The Hoplitic, properly the truly Hoplitic system was an exception even for the same Greeks, within the same Greeks, and also the Macedonian phalanx doesn't spread out of a specific cultural context, and the real achievement of the Carthaginians at that point was to collect the teachings, the mindset, the philosophy of this military culture and adapting it to its own specific military system, and actually surpassing the same Hellenistic school, or better, bringing it to its fullest conclusions with Hannibal during the Punic War. We will talk about that hopefully a lot in dedicated videos, especially of the battles of the Second Punic War. But I mean, this toying with the Hellenistic military thinking can be observed also during the Barcid conquest of Spain, right? And that was a bit of a learning ground for that specific clan to bring forward the same combined arm tactic that at that time was still considered the most effective in the world. Like the Romans also basically stopped fearing the Macedons as a military culture only after probably the Second Punic War, even if during the Pyrrhic experience that they had definitely proven to be something pretty effective as well on their own. We also have to talk about that, which is very important, of course, and that I hinted at in other videos. But once again, there was not an equation to look at Xanthippus the Spartan in Carthage. Basically, the Carthaginians began to fight as Spartans. This is nonsense. It has nothing to do with his history, and actually, there is a kind of aura of mystery and of alleged competence about as if it was an exoteric topic that when you talk about ancient history in this regard, these are just a bunch of sources that have been universally studied now since centuries. We know perfectly what we can know, what we cannot know, because that's pretty much it. Maybe archaeology can bring forward something more, how certain weapons were built, etc. But basically what we know about warfare at the time is what will remain, and there is not much of a further expansion, especially for what we can understand in tactical terms. But there is an important step that I think is gradually taking place thanks to the new generations of scholars, that is widening a little bit more on the actual cultural, political, and social context of these military cultures. That actually helps dramatically to understand what these systems actually thought of themselves like, and not how we have mostly tried to picture them in the second half of the 20th century, chiefly in a kind of what more modern rationalizing way, which is something that still many historians do, and especially those who do not have properly a military bias on these topics. Just think that Connolly basically came up with the thing that the Carthaginians had allegedly, the Macedonians harissa, because he translated from the Loeb dictionary which is basically the heavy javelins of javelin of the Libyan levies. Lybio-Phoenician levies, by the way, with a pike, right? And a lot of drawers, for example, of illustrators actually showed that as if it was a real thing. There are even modern volumes from, I don't know, if you look even at Elsprey, it is pretty famous. People will read this, that you bring people to believe it was actually the case, and there is completely no attention, I think, in mass culture to things like how much, for example, attitude there was or need to adopt a weapon instead than another, how keeping and practice are required to adopt certain systems. There is a kind of a very cheap mechanicism that is brought forward, and this is really not what warfare is about, right? But I don't know why the last generations, including the one I fit in, actually were massively influenced by video games and stuff. So maybe at this point there is this block of millions of young people that presume that they really get it, but what it really is. But the point is that especially for ancient history, you could make that extra step of actually studying the sources, possibly with a knowing the original language, or at least getting a real translation, not a allegedly philological one that doesn't even take into consideration military history as an important aspect of that cultural background you have to take into consideration, and making the effort that is not very much, I can tell you as a medievalist, in comparison to really try to understand how the thing could be. That's also why I make these videos in the first place, trying to stimulate, to provoke sometimes, but still also trying to give a more comforting picture of the fact that after all we mostly already know how things work. And if you look at the most upgraded bibliography, mostly they get it right, albeit there is hardly much. I don't know actually whether this comes mostly from archaeology as a drive, because those of course ancient history is mostly studied through archaeology necessarily at this point, but there is evidently a for example a material cultural phase that shows us something very different, for example from the documentary sources, from the propaganda, from the to what wanted also to be idealized and shown, and what was the reality of of life at the time, for what we can understand. The whole point with the Carthaginian military system is that technically Carthage had its own military force of citizens, right? It also provided officers, as we have seen, and this force was called to fight mostly during emergencies, right? We have this picture that the Carthaginians, especially from the 4th century BC, began to send a corps of citizen troops overseas, right? For example, in Sicily, where they fought pretty bitterly, as 5 wars against the Syracusans. We made a video on the Battle of Tunis just some week ago, and there was this unit that is known as the Sacred Band, right? We don't know actually what it's called in Carthaginian, about which we know very few, frankly. That was constituted 2,500 citizen infantry, that according to the sources were distinguished for their valor, reputation and wealth, and also by the brilliance of their armor, and the slow pace and strict discipline of their advance, that fought in Sicily in 341 BC. Being, however, wiped out, then we know of 2,000 citizen troops that were sent in Sicily once again in 311 BC, and there were perhaps a similar unit, and apparently the last use of citizen troops overseas by Carthage. We know that the Sacred Band was reformed, beaten again at Tunis, as we have seen in 310 BC, and is not heard of thereafter. Right? Larger citizen forces turned out in emergencies, but these seem to have been modest for a city, for the size and wealth of Carthage. And for example, the Battle of the Bagradas in 255 BC, there were 12,000 foot and 4,000 horse, and 10,000 troops mobilized against the rebel mercenaries in 240 BC. It was a pretty risky business for Carthage. And we know that both these armies did contain some mercenaries as well as the citizen levy, which implies, that possibly 8,000 foot or 200 horse at the most, right? So what we get, we will talk about these units more closely in dedicated videos. We'll surely make one about the Sacred Band and another about properly the Carthaginian militia. The point is that we don't know much about them. As far as we are concerned, we know basically from foreign sources what these units were about. The Sacred Band at the Battle of the Cremisus 341 BC was wiped out, but also because they were fighting on this tough ground that disordered and made them more cumbersome. But they actually were said to have fought well, as we will see later, and this is valid also for the Carthaginian citizen infantry in general. The point is that these troops were a few and were not professional, right? We think that they were fundamentally made up of some kind of elite of the city. 2,500 is not really a lot, right? And we can't think of a sort of corps that was built also in here with a degree of social segmentation fundamentally, so not all the units of the Sacred Band were alike. But definitely this resembles fundamentally to the the parallel we could make to the hoplitic militia of the Hellenic city-states. That is, these were properly Carthaginian citizens, drawn usually for their wealth, right? So these were some of the upper strata of the Carthaginian social ladder. We don't know, as we've said before, much about the lower ones that surely fought at some point. And definitely the Sacred Band was something like a picked unit, right? We can't talk about an elite proper, but an elite mostly in terms of heaviness, of quality of the equipment, of this bulky, heavy infantry that could compete with the hoplitic militias of, for example, of the Sicyliot cities, but seemingly not much with the mercenaries. The reason being, in fact, that the Sacred Band doesn't seem to have been a professional unit, right? They were just citizens that we have to think were somewhat skilled in combat. When we talk about non-professional troops in the ancient world, we don't have necessarily to think at someone who is not suited or adapted to the physicality of what warfare represents. The ancient world was literally obsessed with this, heroic myth, right, of the, that really permeated the whole society, right? As we've seen, Carthaginian society was very stratified, was very oligarchic in nature. Therefore, there was a greater social divide in this regard, and the Sacred Band represented the upper class, which definitely had more time or resources anyway to commit in warfare, but was not necessarily trained professionally for all its life for it, right? Naturally, the officers and their guards are figures of this kind. Of course, had a certain degree of professionalism, but the body of the citizen infantry, whether it was the Sacred Band or the rest of the militia, was not, right? So fine troops, courageous, motivated, because generally speaking, here we're talking about the city troops, so someone who is fighting for the benefit of Carthage proper, so that is enough motivated morally to take part in combat. And the absence of a well prepared middle low quality militia in Carthaginian armies speaks for the fact that Carthage lacked a class of small farmers working land outside the city that provided, for example, the bulk, for example, of the Hellenic or the Italic citizen infantries. And most of the land around Carthage formed large estates owned by the nobles and worked by harshly treated Libyan subject, right? And this is important because it basically wasn't that middle class of medium infantry that is typical even of the Roman armies of these times and their Italic allies, and then also of the Hellenic city-states that, however, by the 4th century are increasingly relying themselves generally on mercenary forces, at least more frequently than before. As a consequence, however, wherever there is a greater concentration of resources in the hands of few, there is usually a good cavalry, right? The estates of the oligarchs provided defined horses, which contributed to an important Carthaginian strength in cavalry proper, right? Carthage did have a good, strong cavalry that was properly a civic one, right? Levied even here naturally from the rich, quoting some of them belonging to the wealthy and noble families, right? Equestrian warfare is one of the most important of the sedentary populations of the ancient world, right? It's easy to liquidate the matter saying, cavalry wasn't yet decisive in combat in the Mediterranean, in Europe, right? Yeah, but if you really look at the numbers of cavalry, that was actually pretty large. And in the case of Carthage and other populations, including, frankly, also the Romans, thanks especially to their allies, especially during the Punic Wars, during the Polybian times, let's say, call it in this way, was actually much more important than we think, right? And never commit the mistake of thinking that, the Romans were all about this civic/democratic ideal of the citizen on foot that fought for the good of the republic. That doesn't exist. The Romans had one of the most brutally aristocratic and warlike mindsets that can't be ever conceived. And the Libyan times naturally were already, an advanced moment in the process of, the democratization of the army in some way, but it was never like, a prevalent reality, right? These were increasingly less free individuals that actually joined the system. Was still, even in Rome, regulated actually by an oligarchy that had in its own mindset, in its own heart, actually the cavalry. This is very often overlooked as the model of its own warriorhood, right, and manhood. And this is dramatically overlooked a bit for all the European peoples, but definitely also for, take the Carthaginians, but look at the Near East, in general, right? And see how important, even in Carthaginian religion, the figure of the horse was, right? And how many evidence of this there actually is. And the sacred band was, given this background, probably the only citizen infantry force with the training to fight in I use the term phalanx, let's say, to mean like a thickly packed heavy infantry formation, which is, by the way, the same idea that the Greeks themselves had for the term phalanx, as it was applied even to the formations of the Romans and of the Celts that had technically nothing to do with the Hellenic one. It was more a concept of heavy infantry. And no, Rome didn't actually pass, historically speaking, through any hoplitic phase. This is a myth that has been perpetrated by so many and so much that most people actually believe that there was a time the Romans had something like the copy of an Hellenic phalanx. It never happened, historically speaking. It's an invention that the Romans wrote in the 1st century BC. It never happened. It never happened. We will pass through that as well. But aside from this, we don't know much about the rest of the citizen levy, right? What was their fighting style? We presume it was naturally more individual and presenting looser formations. But the point is that probably these troops didn't quite fight much in the first place, although when they did, albeit inexperienced, the Carthaginian citizens fought decently well, right? Especially considering the threat that was posed to the city. They were motivated enough when at bay to show frantic and extraordinary courage, as the sources put it. This probably had to do with that social strife that we were looking at before. Think about Hannibal, look at Zama, and the Carthaginian militia, of course, wasn't much of a experienced force. It was used in a kind of a containment fashion, but at least they had the guts to stand against the Roman legions and get themselves butchered, and we have to give them credit for it. So this doesn't mean, courage is literally one of the cheapest moral resources that every people has. The problem is that you don't win wars just with courage. But anyhow, we know just very few about what the rest of the Carthaginian militia actually was, because we don't even realize what was concretely the connection between the sacred band and the rest of the Carthaginian citizen troops. But it's meaningful that this force largely disappears, especially a sacred band was the most important, the most effective, the most relevant on the battlefield from the end of the 4th century BC, which is fairly early in time, right? So let's say that Carthage abandons unity. That they had this phase of kind of possibly also more popular influence in its armament it's in city forces and participation, because naturally even the oligarchs had their own interest at participating with their own troops, and you can imagine the internal competition, and that was very, very fierce indeed. We've seen it at Battle of Tunis, right? And usually, by the way, we forgot to say, the Carthaginians elected 2 generals at once, a bit like the Roman consuls, right? It was a collegial office. We don't realize sometimes how really symmetric it was. Like for the Romans, the consuls had they shared power, they alternated. It was even kind of disastrous. Think about Cannae, for example. When the consul wanted to do one thing, the other another one. We have seen, at least in Battle of Tunis, there might have been a substantial asymmetry, which, however, is natural if you consider even the different military experience that these men might have had. But anyhow, there was definitely a citizen commitment at some level in the Carthaginian army. It never quite disappeared, but definitely, however, shrinks dramatically towards the end of the 4th century. On what terms, if at all, the Punic cities that were under Carthage, right? Because Carthage basically had, that they had stemmed from the cities of Tyre and Sidon in Lebanon, and these had conquered by foreign power. So basically, Carthage still sent a regular tribute to the mother city of Tyre, but had extended now sort of an empire on its own on these other Phoenician colonies that were scattered in the Mediterranean, especially in the Western Mediterranean, of the bitter competition between the Greeks and the Phoenicians in that regard. There's a particular character of Phoenician colonialism that it was not a demographic one, like with the Hellenic and Roman ones that were actually demographic colonies, right? It was a bulk of citizenry literally emigrated in these other lands, while for the Carthaginians it was basically a commercial colony, right? We know, of course, of Carthaginians settling in this emporia, right? But not having this, even in here, this bulk of middle class farmers that constituted somewhat, because their society was too oligarchic for that, right? There were certain local governors that were appointed, even sent by the same Carthage. They had some autonomy, political autonomy, for example, signing alliances, trade agreements, and things like these, but were fundamentally part of an aristocratic elite, right? And you don't have much of a Phoenician immigration in that sense as well. And in virtue of her wealth and the exclusion of the citizenry of most of the military activities, Carthage employed large armies, mostly or entirely sometimes composed of mercenaries. Right? We're talking about large numbers that the sources probably even exaggerate. For example, we know of 70,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry and chariotry serving in Sicily in 341. Which is definitely too much. There were probably not more than 50,000 altogether. We know of Hannibal starting his march from Spain to Italy with allegedly 90,000 foot and 12,000 cavalry, right? And the horse usually provided 10-25% of an army, right? No vast proportion, right? But it was usually enough to give a decisive superiority over Greek or Roman opponents, right? And as we will see now, the extraction of the mercenaries was the most diverse. They were literally coming from all the Western Mediterranean and even beyond, in Europe, and they would constitute this kind of characteristic force in Carthaginian service for most of the time that we cover today. So the largest contingents were raised from Carthage's African subjects. These troops are called in different ways, for example, Libyans, though Livy, for example, calls them Africani in Latin, and occasionally there is also the reference to properly the Libio-Phoenicians, right? Libio-Phoenicians. Polybius mentions 450 Libio-Phoenicians and Libyans among the Hannibalic cavalry leaving Spain, right? Distinguishing these two things, we'll try to understand now why. While the same Livy mentions of one of Hannibal's officers, Mutinus of Ipacra, called a Libio-Phoenician and a half-breed African, literally. So the term Libio-Phoenicians was originally used simply to call the Phoenician colonists in Libya, right? It's saying, these are the Phoenicians from Libya, right? But over time, and especially at this point, Libio-Phoenician was used to define the half-breeds, or at least the Libyans who had adopted Punic culture. And so you have to imagine basically Carthage controlling in North Africa this, it had many coastal points, but if the areas where it mostly extended in the hinterland was what would be today's roughly Tunisia and parts of the Libyan coast, right, and part of the hinterland. So these areas were inhabited historically by other populations, right? In fact, Libyans, as we were called at the time, and that were the most immediate populations bordering with Carthaginian, with Carthage and her satellite cities, right? So the idea is naturally that even Carthaginian cities, like in the rest of pre-industrial societies, existed in virtue of the farming production of this great latifundia that we have seen before, in which the locals were employed en masse, right, and exploited, and having, however, a probably quite shaded type of connections with the Carthaginians. Some were properly subjects, we can say, and they would provide conscripts for the Carthaginian army. It was a bit like the foedera iniqua for the Romans, right? These populations that were basically, fully dominated, and that had to serve with troops just because, the masters wanted. Other communities of Libya would have, a more, symmetrical relation with Carthage, right? So we're probably different types of conscription and hire and recruitment in general. We can imagine, I think, even in Carthaginian history, the Libyan element to have somewhat improved in importance over time, if anything, as literally as canon, not literally, of course, meat, in the sense that like it's a bit like Rome with the italics, right? These were the guys who actually served even in greater numbers in the Carthaginian. And in fact, properly the most numerous African element in the Carthaginian army were the Libio-Phoenicians, like the African infantries of Hannibal that constituted the bulk of its, the most faithful, the veterans that eventually fought and died to the last at Zama, were extracted from these populations. And you understand from their importance in this regard that this weren't like rabble, like, as we will see later, for example, the Numidian infantry that also existed on foot, in fact, aside from the more famous cavalry. But they were probably well trained and well framed under Carthaginian discipline, and in a way representing this external element to the city system that didn't possibly have much of a of a chance. I mean, foreign mercenaries were more dangerous, especially think about the Gauls, the other also stronger units that somewhat were less framed within the Carthaginian system, where they were hired, and they did it for like the Libyans probably were as satellites of Carthage, now more like inside the system, and probably not being exploited at the point of not receiving any benefit from. In fact, Carthaginian infantry can be more stereotypically represented with the Libio-Phoenicians proper. the Libyans formed the majority of the mercenaries. For example, who rebelled in 240, which means that even if they, were not properly Carthaginians, they saw and they realized their importance in Africa in relation with Carthage. So, in that case, because their pay was overdue, actually. So there is also this degree of mercenarism that is not entirely right about the being framed under Carthage as such. And this occasion is important also because there were disaffected Libyan peasants that joined the revolt, right? So this naturally speaks for the intensive use that Carthage made of these troops that in this occasion were confident enough to ask for more after all, right? Probably the way Carthage employed these troops was possibly harsher than how the Romans dealt with the Italics, that after all, stuck with her, even when Hannibal managed to make some of them rebel. The Libyans properly also, in this case, we can see that something was going on, but we don't have a news of this mass betrayal of the Libyans in general within the Carthaginian system. So the relations were different compared to the ones between the Romans and the Italics. Also, they were properly and possibly weaker in general as communities, right? The Italics, after all, were pretty diverse, even in terms of army articulation, right? They had cavalry, somewhat medium infantry. I mean, they were fairly good, right? The Libyans were similar, but possibly poorer in general. There is no comparison between the rich per capita of the Italic peasantry and the Libyan one at this point. Also, the numbers were probably more limited overall. And Carthage even had a provision for a large garrison of Libyan forces within the city, right? Appian says that there were barracks and stables for 24,000 men, 4,000 horses, and 300 elephants built into the walls, right? And this garrison would have been huge, right, even for Carthage, which probably instead had a small standing army of Libyans, right? Perhaps including the same properly Lybio-Phoenicians, because you see, properly the Libyans were more far away from Carthage towards the southeast, right? Well, the Lybio-Phoenicians were kind of the ones that were the populations were closer to Carthage. So Libyan mercenaries were used, for example, also by the Ptolemies at some point. So there were lots of free Libyans that were properly mercenaries on their own account compared to the Lybio-Phoenicians. This garrison also, fairly plausibly, contained professional troops of other races, right? We could talk literally about wherever you could find in the Western Mediterranean. Italics, Iberians, Gauls. Carthage, in this sense, had also its own arsenals that could provide equipment for an enormous amount of troops. These were in the hands of the oligarchy when the city was seized by Rome in the Third Punic War. 200,000 infantry panoplies were said to have been found by actually surrendered to the conquerors. And when, after the first war with Rome, Hamilcar Barca had begun to consolidate a large province in Spain, a sort of second standing army developed there, right? Especially since warfare was virtually constant. This also has many parallels with what the Romans will be doing in Spain, right? The crisis of the Polybian system, so-called Polybian system, and the professionalization of the Roman military passes largely through the recruitment crisis brought by the Spanish campaign, say, and this kind of Vietnam, right? It is of ambushes. Actually, Rome was up to fairly late in time not fully committed to world conquest of Spain. So that's the reason actually why they got bogged down. But the Carthaginians had struggled hard as well to keep to conquer essentially, especially the Iberian tribes and also the Celtiberian ones, in part, and that's where also much of what we see in the Second Punic War was forged. Like the Barcids went through this kind of family tradition of warfare that was passed down to generation from a generation in that context, and that allowed the Barcids to have actually a professional army, right? Skilled troops that had been fighting in some of the worst theaters of war ever in the ancient world. Ask them, and ask the Romans eventually, and that naturally created this base of of professionals that were at that point under the control of the Barca, and that naturally the Carthaginian Senate didn't like at all, right? And that's the reason why they didn't quite support Hannibal during the Second Punic War, because otherwise, Carthaginian logistics might have and dramatically helped this, even if it was by the Second Punic War still kind of very much weaker than the Roman one, especially for the naval, the maritime connection. And the interesting aspect of the Barcid army of Spain is that this too was largely Libyan. When he left for Italy, Hannibal is meant to have left something like up to 12,000 Libyan infantry, 450 horse, right, in Spain. And to this we have to add the allegedly 20,000 African infantry that he said he brought with himself, and of only 12,000 of which actually reached Italy, as the dramatic situation in southern Gaul. Well, the Celtic tribes obstacled the Allobroges, obstacled his march, and think about crossing the Alps and etc. So that's actually a very large African element that would be interesting to expand on further. Maybe we'll do it in the dedicated video on African infantry, and it's mostly infantry, by the way, right? And this also makes you think that there might have been something social going on, actually, especially among the Lybio-Phoenicians proper, to arrive en masse in Spain, right? Or maybe it was just mostly the Libyans that poured through this Carthaginian channel to Spain, because they would find employment as mercenaries there. But these are high quantities of troops, right? And they would form the bulk of the Carthaginian army in many ways, some of the most reliable troops, as we've seen. So it's interesting that there is also very few Carthaginian or African cavalry with Hannibal during the Second Punic War, right? Aside from maybe, surely his bodyguard might have been composed by them, while the rest of the cavalry in Italy, think about Cannae, was composed chiefly by Spaniards, Gauls, and Numidians. And this is in fact the last one was this important element, right, of let's say the other major African part of the Carthaginian army, the Numidian light cavalry that we have. I think we made a video on Numidian tactics specifically, so you can go check that out. And these troops were used in the 4th century, though they were not very prominent at the time. It's by the 3rd century BC that they are raised from allied kings of Numidia, so rather than as pure mercenaries, which in many ways doesn't make an excessive sense. You always consider that the term mercenary doesn't mean anything, like that there are soldiers, right? And we should see, and unfortunately we can't all the time, how these troops were filled alike. How much was paid, or just political interest to participate next to the Carthaginians or their enemies, like it would happen, for example, before Zama. Their kings, the Numidian kings, would command these contingents. At this point, think about Sifax, in fact, the same Zama. And cavalry were levied from several tribes of Numidia in this regard: the Masili, the Masasili, the Macae, and also the Moors and the Gaetuli, or Getuli if you prefer, that were levied together with the Numidians. It's not easy to divide these peoples in their actual. I mean, they were pretty close to them. Like the Moors were even, married into the Numidian royalty, right? So the Getuli were living south of Numidia, so these populations, the closer to the Garamantians, for example. So they weren't probably differing dramatically in character. Actually, these peoples were somewhat primitive in nature, especially the Getuli. Like, Numidia was a set of small kingdoms that eventually were, compacted more, especially after the Second Punic War, but also the Carthaginians had started this political thing. The Moors had, mostly Mauritania, in this area, they would create their own kingdom on the long run, but especially by the 4th to 3rd century BC, they're still fairly, not too, we could say, and they were actually very scarcely stratified societies. Like, even their tactical specialization in this sense was pretty monotonous, right? They were fundamentally skirmishers, right? We mostly remember the Numidians as cavalrymen, and rightfully so, but we sometimes overlook the light infantry element that may also have been used, right? For example, Sifax is said to have allegedly trained and provided 50,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry to an allied army in 204 BC, right? And if you had, we talked about these things actually in the Numidian tactics video, and you have to imagine literally like the equipment of a Numidian warrior being the same on foot and on horseback. Like, in general, of course, there were minor differences, but the typology of the trooper was fundamentally the same. Basically no armor at all, right? These troops were all about hit-and-run tactics, skirmishing, mostly. The kings and their entourage would have some armor, of course, of some sort, but prevalently they were, this extremely speedy and, in fact, also numerous force. These peoples were, as we've seen before, the North African interland has never been dramatically populated, demographically strong, but the point is that these peoples were all kind of tribesmen, so that they all had some minimal military expertise, mostly in raiding warfare, but that's fundamentally what light cavalry or infantry should be about in order to make a decent job, right? These were known, in fact, some of the finest horses out there. The Moors, for example, would be, for centuries, some of the finest numeri cavalry that the Romans employed. And the tradition here went on. For example, the Romans were the ones credited for introducing camels in the local warfare through trade, breeding, etc. And at this date, in this period, the Numidians mostly sided with Rome, right? But there were a few Numidian and Moorish cavalry at Zama among the Carthaginians, right? 2 exiled leaders with 6,000 men also joined Carthage against their own king Massinissa in 150. And a few fought on during the last war with Rome. The political fragmentation of the media was, quite easy to see this bipartition and side switching. Think about how the thing was that, during the Second Punic War, it was a race between the Carthaginians and the Romans to take from their side the Numidian forces that were so important for Zama. For example, from the Roman side. For what concerns light infantry in the Carthaginian armies, we do not know, we don't have a nation that identifies them precisely in the sources. Some are called Moors, but they probably included Numidians and Libyans alike. Moors are also occasionally present as archers. And we're talking always naturally about this kind of light standard that characterized North African, their kind of tribal warfare. Another very important element that we have mentioned before are the Spanish troops, right, that fought as mercenaries. Actually, most early Carthaginian armies, right, but they were used in large quantity only when Carthage's Spanish province was enlarged after the first Punic War, right, first Roman War from the Carthaginian side. And it was at that point possible to raise large armies from subject Spanish tribes, right? You know, the southern, what would be known by the Romans as Baetica, right, the south of Spain, what today would be Andalusia, roughly, right? It was rich in precious metals, and these were used by the Barcids to naturally to hire many troops from the Iberian hinterland. And these were probably subjects of Carthage in part. Also because the Barcids were technically operating with this ambiguity, even on behalf of the motherland or mother city. And such mass levies, especially of the Iberians, were somewhat unreliable and unenthusiastic. Right? This is showed, for example, by the battles of Ibera and Ilipa. And many of them were very quick to desert to the Romans. Others, however, fought better, right? The army that Hannibal brought to Italy originally included many Iberian levies, some of whom were dismissed to their homes before they crossed the Pyrenees, while others were left to garrison the cities of northern Iberia for the Carthaginians. Both Iberian cavalry and infantry remained, however, and 8,000 infantry reached Italy, right? And perhaps a third of the 6,000 cavalry of the Hannibalic army were Iberian. These troops were, in general, of high quality, right? Loyal to their general in that campaign, and they were also experienced in discipline at that point. Among the Spanish elements, there were definitely Iberians, but also Celtiberians and Lusitanians, right? That were actually different peoples in many ways. Now it's complex to draw an accurate picture of who was who in this context, also ethnically, originally speaking. But say that the Iberians were on average lighter troops. The Celtiberians resembled more like the Gallic tradition, but with certain specific local characteristic. The Lusitanians were actually of Indo-European origin, the Iberians not, and they were somewhat more, however, they were there before the Celts. They maintained some also interesting characters. There weren't probably many dramatic differences between these people. Let's say that the more you get to the Celtic side of the Isle, as you'll see now, how you have heavier infantry, while to the Iberian side of the Isle you have more like lighter troops. But this is also somewhat stereotypical in many ways, and we will have to do a serious video about Iberian warfare, say Spanish warfare, considering that, in fact, we're talking about the Spain as the peninsula overall. Sorry, Portugal, I didn't want to offend you in this regard, but including, in fact, even the Lusitanians, in fact, the Celtiberians and Iberians as the major element, aside from the Punic and Hellenic element on the coasts. And 4,000 good Celtiberian mercenaries crossed to Africa in 1204 as well. Right, the Celtiberians were tough guys, right? They fought sometimes to the last, and they were mostly this kind of close fighting infantry known as the scutari, right? Because of the in the Latin terminology, at least, that defines them by the size of their, even or the importance in anyhow of their shields, right? These were tougher troops than, for example, the caetrati, that were mostly, if not properly skirmishers, at least light infantry, that were possibly most of Hannibal's Spanish troops. Right, they were in fact known as this because of the hydra. It was this smaller shield, like a buckler, fundamental. And this was an important difference. That's why we mostly, both the Celtiberians and the Iberians had both the typologies of troops, and that reflect largely the same segmentation you can find even among the Celts, with the heavier infantries with large shields, and then the skirmishers among the Germans, among the Italics, and the Thracian stations, and so on. And Polybius describes the Spanish infantry organized into spadae, right, and living in cohortes, respectively, Hellenic and Latin. Now, what's the deal here? The concept is that spadae, at least etymologically speaking, means units that fight under same banner. Livy uses cohort in this regard as, in meaning, of course, not the same, referring to the homonymous Roman unit. And in fact, we don't have to think that these troops were organized in Hellenistic or Roman patterns. Right here, we should make a very powerful digression about what these troops really are. Right, because, for example, the term spadae is used also by the Scipio's cohorts in Spain. That the Roman cohort is actually not born with Mari. It was at least because of Polybius witnessed this, experimented at least by Scipio in against the Carthaginians in Spain. And the concept being that the spadae means units that fight under the same banner. Right, and the concept was that Scipio would use fundamentally this the cohort as the sum of the 3 maniples at a time. Actually, not with the usual segmentation as there will be remain even in the Marian administrative reform of the Astati, Principes, and Triari, but actually splitting the 3 lines. Right, with one block of all of Stati, of all the legions was employing together, and the Principes all together. So that is complicated. We'll see it in the battles that we will deal with. Actually, we made a video on the Battle of Ilipa in which we discuss exactly that maneuver, right? In which we explained what the thing meant. But when we read the Iberians or Celtic Iberians fighting in spadae or cohortes, here we're talking about the idea of larger bodies, properly, of troops brought together for higher maneuverability, or commandability proper, and fighting in a very different fashion from, the spadae is a term that Polybius even uses for the phalanx units at the Battle of Ausculum under Pyrrhus, right? So it's literally the idea that you brigade certain units under same banner, and you put them together. This is the etymology proper. And the same is for the cohort in Latin. For example, the cohortes were known in the in later terminology in Latin sources also for the Italic infantry of the Polybian times, right? So, but that has nothing to do with the eventual developments of the cohort during the 2nd century BC, right? With this origin actually in the 2nd Punic War at the beginning of the 3rd. It's a very complex thing. Nobody has properly ever written something precise about this, ever. I should also look more thoroughly into this, but I can't tell you, at least for the later developments, but I can surely tell you that what we're talking about, this terminology in the 2nd Punic War, when we find it in this case, we're not talking about this imitations, etc. It's just a term, and you have to understand what it means in the context. Like, these terms are referred in many other occasions, right? Think about the long K. By the way, we didn't talk about the equipment of the Lybio-Phoenicians, by the way. There's another digressions that, essentially they fought with shield, and this long K, it was, in fact, a spear/javelin, which is basically what most of, the peoples out there in tribal warfare had. Like, all the peoples fundamentally fought with a spear/javelin, and sometimes, but not always, with a sword, right, and a shield. actually with a shield basically all times, not with a sword all times. But the lonke is this term that is Greek actually, so it belongs once again to a foreign historiography. But Polybius, for example, uses it at a certain point to talk about the javelins of the Ptolemaic marines, right? So you understand that when he defines that for the Lybio-Phoenicians, he's talking about a type of weapon, not the fact that this was somewhat more specific to the Lybio-Phoenicians and other peoples. The lonke was shorter and lighter than the pila, and therefore many people say, that the Lybio-Phoenicians, for example, there is a passage I think from the Battle of Cannae that says that if I'm not wrong, that the Lybio-Phoenicians kind of looked identical to the Romans because they had taken their coat of mail and shields and other weapons like the gladius or the pilum. I don't remember how the source specifically says, but that is often quoted as if the Lybio-Phoenician veterans of Hannibal now had transformed themselves into Roman legionnaires. This is also completely false. First of all, there's no evidence of that. Secondly, when you get a weapon, you don't actually fight with the in the way that the unit fights, right? If I find, I don't know, a Celtic panoply, doesn't mean I fight like a Celt. If I have a Hellenic panoply, look at the so-called Etruscan or Roman hoplites, it's literally nothing to do with, Hellenic phalanxes used by those peoples. It's just a different thing, and we will have to dwell on this at some point, also precisely. And that witness actually tells us that at least just the first ranks of the Lybio-Phoenician infantry were equipped similarly to the Romans because of fallen equipment, etc. And while it's actually likely that they took things like, I don't know, the coat of mail and especially armor in general for higher protection, I mean, the economy of their combat where they used to fight would probably discourage from taking scutum and pilum with them, right? Because the word it takes a lot of use and organization and time to adapt to that type of fighting in the way it was developing in the manipular tactics. And it's likely that the Libyans, overwhelmingly, even the Annibalic veterans, always fought with their original, let's say, ethnic weapons, and they didn't keep them up, right? So it's been stressed also mechanicistically, this idea that there would have been a sort of Roman copy of the, let's say a Carthaginian copy of the Roman legionnaires within the Libyan troops of Hannibal. This is not true, right? There is no evidence that there was no reform whatsoever, nothing of this. So the point I was making with the lonke in that sense is that when you find these terms in the classical sources, you have always to ask yourself what they meant for the authors of the time. And of course we can't know that, but if you find them in other accounts and you see to which weapons they're associated, you understand way better a lot of things. And just as we were saying before, yeah, the lonke was the one that was mistranslated as pike when it's actually a javelin, and therefore, according to someone, the Carthaginians now had pikemen just like the Macedonians, right? The Carthaginians never had anything of that kind. Even the Macedonian contingent that was allegedly sent by Philip V towards the end of the Punic War, actually at the same Battle of Zama, is considered by most of in help to the Carthaginians with the Macedonians were allied against the Romans, is considered by most scholars to be just an invention. In fact, Macedonia wasn't faring very well, economically speaking, at the time, and also, by the way, phalanx works. If you have a lot of troops, this aid seems to be, quite significant. And at Battle of Zama, however, we don't basically have any evidence of that whatsoever. This is just a parenthesis, I think, about the Lybio-Phoenician equipment, because that tells you how here we are, by the way, passing by all the great battles of especially of the Barces, and their tactics, and the masterpieces of take Cannae, which is the unsurpassed peak of ancient warfare. If not, eventually the Romans will reach that point and remain there, however, because conceptually that's literally the surpassing of the combined arms of, Hellenistic school and this broader, idea, not just of hammer and anvil with cavalry and infantry respectively, but basically of a formation that all works synergically all together. This is what properly Hannibal does, right? What Scipio is able to emulate, and defeating ultimately Hannibal, also because he made a perfect campaign in Spain and then in Africa as well. But I emphasize the thing of the Lybio-Phoenician equipment because it should make you understand better the concept that you don't need a type of troop that looks like another to have a brilliant tactic. In other words, the Lybio-Phoenician infantry was enough, equipped the way it was, to reach the masterpiece of Cannae that not even the Macedonian warfare had properly reached, right, with pikemen. So you don't need pikemen to have Hellenistic warfare, you don't need pikemen just to win battles in general, and with that specific formula. Not even in their combined tactics proper with cavalry whatsoever. So Carthage is actually very didactic in this sense because it really shows you the great flexibility and experimentalism and vision that first Hamilcar, then Hannibal had, and that had experimented in a way some the greatest feats of the ancient world, tactically speaking. Up to that point, nobody had ever done anything like that. This great maneuvers, this great connection. Naturally, this was possible just with professional troops, right? What not even the Romans properly had at that point. That's why Scipio's army actually becomes that. And with a specific type of strategy, not just of not just their nature. They were legionnaires like all the others, but they're employed in a different way. And the Romans would have not won that war just by following Quintus Fabius Maximus principles. And this is also another great prejudice that results there, that Fabius Maximus changed everything, was turned to war. He basically did what any other general would have done at that point, and no, he would have not won the war continuing that strategy, right? Without Scipio and his vision, things would have gone, maybe Rome would have not lost, but things would have gone in different ways, and with much greater cost for the Romans themselves. This is another thing. You see how many, look, the Second Punic War is the single most didactic, let's put it in this way, campaign you can ever study. Like, if you once in your life you really want to do a serious thing with sources, reading them all and analyzing them one by one, do it with the Second Punic War, because it's literally the most complete tactical and strategical exercise you can do, historically speaking. Other very famous mercenaries that were employed by the Carthaginians and eventually by the Romans, for example, were the Balearic slingers, who were very effective but never numerous. If anything, just look at the Balearic demographics at that time. But were definitely specialists in their crafts, right? Together with the Rhodians, were considered to be as a matter of fact, the best slingers in the ancient world. Hannibal left 500 slingers in Spain, sent 870 to Africa, and probably had less than 1,000 himself, right? Which is, however, not very few after all, and very useful in the tough Apenninic terrain, ground, and with all this difference in heights and ambushes and skirmishes and forests, and archers were rarely used, right? The Balearics were often the only long-range missile troops in a Carthaginian army. Actually, there is this thing about how was really archer in the ancient world. Why does it seem that in Middle Ages slings declined and archery increases? Right? These are all questions we can't properly answer. but there was a debate in the ancient world. As a matter of fact, slingers were conceived to be generally better, right? Seemingly even have a higher range actually, and they were mostly effective against either large targets, but especially armored ones, right? Because they threw this kind of lead nuts that pierced through armor, and they were at least traumatically wounded the enemies underneath their cuirasses, etc. And they were, slingers were fairly common in the ancient world, but always in somewhat contained numbers. Iberians made extensive use of slingers in general by themselves. There's not much in Italy as far as I know. Something in the Celtic world, yes, they're somewhat evident as well. Sardinian troops were used in 393 BC, but we do not see much afterwards. Few Ligurians were hired. These troops Sardinians were famous for their hit-and-run tactics, especially archery, but they were also somewhat tough warriors on their own. Ligurians were more like Celtic, that they were Celticized at this point. As a population, we know of Ligurians sent to Sicily in 342 under the Carthaginians to presumably fight at the Battle of Cremisus. We know of Hannibal leaving 300 of them in Spain. Right? Consider that the Ligurians had been fierce opponents of the Romans. The Romans struggled a lot. After the Samnites, probably the Ligurians were the toughest people resisting to Rome in the conquest of the Italian peninsula. We also have, in fact, many Ligurians joining Hasdrubal, in Hannibal's brother, in his attempt to reach Italy, as you know, that ended the Battle of Metaurus River. We know of Ligurians at Zama as well from the Carthaginian side. A Carthaginian officer, one Hamilcar. The Carthaginians had even less fantasy for names than the Romans, so you can imagine what this means. And was still stirring up the Gauls and Ligurians against Rome in 200 BC. Right, there was this resistance. There were Carthaginians that remained in northern Italy to actually, in fact, continue because those areas had been conquered by Rome, and with the Hannibalic invasion, the Carthaginians had maintained those garrisons in there while things were going bad in Spain and Africa. Some, kept pushing the local Celts and Ligurians after the war was over, and eventually Rome reconquered the area. And mercenary Gauls also served at the Battle of Cremisus, while in the First Punic War, Hamilcar Barca had about 3,000 Gauls in Sicily, of whom 2,000 later joined the mercenary revolt. And also large number of Celts were used by Hannibal, but only when he was persuaded by the Boii and the Insubres, so these Cisalpine Gauls, to support his invasion of Italy. Right? These were peoples that resisted to Rome. They provided actually large amounts of troops. 5,000 cavalry and 9,000 infantry at the Battle of the Trebia River, which makes 1/3 of Hannibal's infantry and half of his horse. So the Celtic element was pretty strong on that occasion. Some Gauls also joined later Carthaginian ventures, such as Hamilcar's expedition. Right? There were Hellenic mercenaries in Carthaginian employ, right? Especially during the wars in Sicily, where there were many Sicyliot cities providing their, sometimes their troops, but more generally this florid mercenary market that existed in the island. And they were first hired, according to Plutarch, however, later source, in 340, because after the Cremisus, the Carthaginians, quote, had come to admire them, that is, the Greeks, as irresistible troops and the most warlike to be found anywhere. Right? This is very important because, objectively, as we've seen also the Battle of Tunis, like the these Sicily is very fascinating in this context because it somewhat pioneered also part of that Hellenistic military developments that the same Carthaginians were influenced by, in the sense that the Siciliot cities mostly abandoned the traditional politic phalanx, right? This is basically the history of all Hellenic colonies in a nutshell, right? Geopolitical tactics, aside from the fact that now we're somewhat transforming also in the Hellenic motherland, were never replicated properly outside of the Hellenic motherland herself, right? For many reasons. But aside from this, the Syracusans, for example, had, similarly to the Carthaginians, actually almost all mercenaries in their armies. At least their crack troops were mercenaries, right? And it was plenty of these, essentially either hoplites or turophoroi, that were employed as professionals. Occasional early, and the Carthaginians didn't have this because there was some kind of Hellenic influence in Libya. We talked about some Libyo-Hellenic troops even, but especially in the area of Kyrene, for example. That was probably the most important city, and not even in Libya, because there was Cyrenaica though, but there was some Hellenistic influence even in Africa, indeed, aside from the Carthaginian medium. But definitely the Carthaginians didn't have access to much of Greeks, because most of them could be found in Sicily, and much of in the Western Mediterranean, of course, there were Hellenic colonies, but they were usually against the Phoenician ones, so they definitely had less. And the Chrymisos, as you have seen, is when the sacred band is defeated by these professional Hellenic troops. So that's why the Carthaginians begin to admire them and realize even in there the importance of mercenary armies proper. And occasional early references might all be to mercenaries in the hire of Sicilian Greek tyrants, right, who sometimes sided with Carthage against Syracuse. So it was not even properly the Carthaginians hiring them by themselves. And most Hellenic mercenaries were hoplites, but in 309 BC, also Hellenic cavalry is found fighting bravely against Agathocles of Syracuse, in Africa. That is fascinating because it means that that there was a market of equestrian troops as well, which is shouldn't be so surprising, but you can find in Africa, even in this political move of the other Siciliot cities that didn't want Syracuse to take over all the island to fight for the Carthaginians, in that sense, that were threatened at their heart, while they were actually threatening the same Syracuse themselves at that point. And their determination is explained when we learn that of the 1,000 Hellenic prisoners taken during the war, 500 were Syracusan exiles themselves, right? So they were political enemies of Agathocles proper. And in the First Punic War, Hellenic mercenaries were still used by the Carthaginians, notably Spartan officer Xanthippus, as we have mentioned him before. We skipped of what he actually did. He basically retrained the Carthaginian army. Many people think it was to cope with the Romans, and the Romans would be defeated. They lost 20 years of war at that point because of their dash into Africa was ill prepared or commanded. We'll talk about that battle. Xanthippus is meant to have basically retrained the Carthaginian army according to certain disciplinary lines. It didn't reform the Carthaginian military according, for example, to the Hellenic guidelines, right? As we were saying before, the Carthaginians didn't start fighting as the Greeks did, or the Macedonians. It was just about a qualitative standard of discipline and of order, right? And other aspect, minor aspect, we don't fully know, actually. We don't have precise information on this, so but it's mostly these teachings that remained among the Carthaginian oligarchy, including the Barcid one, that put them to better use in this broader, developments that they achieved in Spain, right? But at that point, even if the Carthaginians managed, to fence off the Romans from Africa, they didn't transition into some other military system as a consequence. During the Mercenaries revolt in 240 BC, there were many Greeks of different background. Let's say they were mostly deserters and slaves, right? And they took part in it. Livy claims that a legion of Macedonians fought at Zama, right? And this is what we were saying about before, this nonsense, at least considered so by modern writers, and Livy definitely brought, from very different context, and needing even here to be, there would, I think I have an idea why he wrote this, but let's keep it for now. But it definitely, an historiographical thing. It's not really, what happened, right? And I don't even remember if he mentions like the foul. He says a legion, so it's not even those who mention Macedonian pikemen in the hands of the Carthaginians. I don't think they are actually even, it's even true. This might have been other mercenary troops of Macedonia, like Turiophroi or Agranians, or I don't know what. But, well, legion sounds more like infantry indeed. But anyhow, these Macedonians are not mentioned in Polybius' more reliable account, right? Actually, at this time, the kingdom of Macedon was at peace with Rome, and since King Philip had not ventured to support Carthage even when she was winning, he was hardly likely to start now. So in any case, he would have not transported troops to Africa as Rome controlled the sea, right? Which was the whole deal of the Second Punic War, actually, and his own fleet was fully engaged elsewhere. And it's annalist's fiction, calling the Macedonian a legion, hints at that the annalists tended to misuse anachronistic Roman terminology, then inspired by Rome's later hostility to Philip. So this is partly the point, but there is a deeper, let's say, question having to do what Livy was meaning, what Rome actually did in terms of learning from them in turn. But that's another. Let's not digress. Another important element in the Carthaginian armies, and not only related to Hannibal's war, were the italics, right? They're found in the early armies. For example, we have in 410 BC 800 Campanian cavalry. That especially the city of Capua, there were these, the Italic tribes that had taken over this earlier city-state that of the coast, and that had this powerful oligarchy that, by the way, rebelled eventually during his Second Punic War against Rome, supporting Hannibal, and getting eventually literally beheaded by the Romans at the end of the war. We know of 311 Etruscans, who were not Italics. Let's call them Italian peoples altogether, the Italian peninsula. While one of the rebel mercenary leaders in 240 BC was a Campanian. Larger Italian forces were used when Hannibal invaded Italy herself. Capua in Campania. Most of the Samnites were the greatest enemies of Rome in Italy. The Lucani and the Bruti, that were also other southern Italic tribes that joined Hannibal. Hannibal also had some Roman deserters in his army himself, as at one point putting them at the head of his column to bluff his way into a town, right? So playing cleverly in this regard with turncoats. Some armies under Punic command were almost entirely Italic, actually, right? For example, at Beneventum in 214 BC, under Carthaginian general There were at some point 17,000 infantry, mostly from the Bruti and the Lucani, and 1,200 cavalry, mostly Numidians, Moors, and a few Italics. The Bruti, that were perhaps the most determined of the allies, however, because they, that they were one of the most primitive Italic tribes living in the mountains of Calabria, and that's where basically Hannibal was bottled up at the end of the campaign, when the Romans gradually managed to push him down for the peninsula, and they were the only ones. The Bruti were the only Italic tribe now supporting Hannibal, and together with him, he almost made the Roman legions falling into another cannae during an ambush in the Bruttian mountains. And the Romans were terrified. They deployed 8 legions just they feared Hannibal so much to confrontate him in open field after Cannae, while Scipio was dealing with the stuff in Spain. And the Bruti mobilized 15,000 men of their own. Right. This also tells you about the enormous, actually, demographic strength of Italy. Right. For example, the Carthaginian objective was to make the Romano-Italic confederation break, that is, to make all these Italic peoples rebelling to Rome. But Carthage had absolutely not the strength, resources to subdue Italy as a land of conquest. It simply was too overly populated and too rich, right? They didn't have nor the economic nor the demographic strength to subdue these populations, but at least they hoped to knock Rome out of the way. And some Brutians, some Bruti, better in Latin, followed Hannibal from Italy and fought in the third line at Zama, along with the other veterans. And Livy even states that this line was all Italic, but that's actually not correct. An important part of the story has to do, of course, with chariots and elephants that are somewhat iconic. Carthaginian troops allied into different stages of the Carthaginian military development. So in the 4th century, the Carthaginians made considerable use of 4-horse chariots. It's not clear whether the crews were Libyans operating native style, because we actually have examples of North African populations fielding this kind of chariots, a bit like in Northern Europe. North Africa lived at the outskirts of the major military, improvements, and chariot warfare had declined. It existed in Hellenistic warfare especially, and it's interesting that Libyan chariots, and like the Carthaginian ones, were employed in here by Libyans. It's not just about the guys of the hinterland, sometimes even important coastal centers, somewhat. So made use of the larger chariot, of the kind of smashing one, not the agile, smaller one like you find, for example, in Britain, that had just 2 horses. So this is important because you can see how in part the Carthaginians were fitting into the broader, updated late stage of chariot warfare development. And however, this still fits in a kind of an archaic phase, right, where you would preferably find even possibly in Carthage herself this kind of heroic warfare that implied, the warrior mounted on chariot going to war, etc. But possibly what we see in this late stage has actually to do with the mass charge proper in the Hellenistic style, as far as we understand. There are battles in which this is somewhat evident. Chariots were also used as a screen, and naturally to sent as we've seen at the Battle of Tunis, for example, as well. That was the employment in a fully systematized and functionalized employment of chariots, war chariots, together with cavalry, and just for smashing the enemy lines, not really being the spearhead of the formation in terms of, like we saw, for example, at the Battle of Montgrapius for the Celts, or the Caledonians in that case, actually, where these were kind of the finest element of the unit, because they landed these proper noblemen that fought sometimes on, descending from the chariot and, participating to the ones that were in the front line as well. In a way, it may be that chariot warfare was important in Carthaginian armies since the time of the Phoenician colonization. I mean, in terms of the ancient, think about Assyrian warfare that we mentioned even before. That is important in terms of military influence, right? So we know, however, that at this stage the thing had somewhat evolved. There were seemingly 300 chariots in Sicily in 343 BC, allegedly 2,000 at Battle of Tunis in 310. We explained there how the thing was possibly, it's maybe rather the number of the crews. However, there were, much less chariots, especially considering they were really bulky, large things. So even just from a logistical point of view, consider 4 horses per each. It means 8,000. It's too large. And after these battles, in fact, we find, however, that the chariot fell, out of use, right? Probably because it was, relatively ineffective, and elephants also, from the 70s of the 3rd century BC seemed more promising in this regard. And in fact, as we were saying in the beginning of the video, the Carthaginians first met war elephants when they fought Pyrrhus in Sicily in 278 BC. They must have made a great impression, as by 262 Carthage had an elephant force of her own, right? So we made, by the way, a video on war elephants in the ancient world, including the Carthaginian ones. We've talked about it, and you can check that out as well. And Carthage mostly used the small North African elephant, as we've seen. Ptolemaic Egypt might have provided assistance at the first mahouts, right? And indeed, there seem to have been a few Indian elephants that found their way into Carthaginian employ, right? Which can only have come via Egypt at that point. The Ptolemaics used both African and Indian elephants at that point. And the Mahouts are called Indians, but it rather seems at that point to have become a synecdoche for elephant drivers, regardless of the Indian origin itself. And a few true Indians may have come, however, via Egypt to start the corps, and later Mahouts included Sub-Saharan Africans and Moors, right? That also, think about the market, that the exports where also the Carthaginians took the elephants from and trade routes. And the Carthage had stables for 300 elephants, as we've seen before. Hapian said in the city garrison, and this number was never fielded. The 140 used in Sicily, about 252 being the largest number known, right? And known were used after Zama, interestingly enough, while, for example, the Romans began to employ elephants at that point, that were given to them by the Numidians, right? So Carthage basically arrived fairly late, and exploiting also these local African trade routes to import pachyderms from Central Africa. And we will be talking about this also in detail and trying to be even more detailed. Of course, this is just for the record. It's not that chariots and elephants were dramatically important for the Carthaginians as well. I mean, they're kind of iconic, especially the elephants. But after all, we've seen in that video on war elephants in the ancient world, I mean in the Hellenistic era, how what was their actual role, and why eventually they fell out of use, or were, however, used in small numbers in the West, right? Yeah, I think this sums up in general what the Carthaginian army mostly was about. We will, I think, explain more clearly what the Carthaginian tactics were in the first place, just in outline, and then eventually analyzing every single Carthaginian battle. We already talked about 2, I think, and we will keep naturally doing, passing throughout all the Punic wars and in general the other Carthaginian military activities. And we will be talking dedicated videos also about the specific kind of troops, their equipment, their background, their differences, etc. We already started. Carthage didn't come out in this random topic choice that we make, and up to now, at least this video is going to cover, at least for Carthaginian warfare, in an introductive way. And always bear in mind that this is probably one overlooked topic to understand a lot, actually, also about the Hellenistic and Roman warfare, right? Because through the Carthaginian one, there is actually a very good coping with both of them, and naturally all the Punic wars that made school in this sense, and why the system failed eventually, but also what was capable of accomplishing, especially from a tactical point of view. And it tells a lot about especially the idea that you don't really need to have one typology of fighter to replicate a certain type of military intuition. Like war is not just about weapons. It's not just about formations, right? It's way more than that. Actually, these are possibly the least important aspects of the story. But once again, in popular culture, it seems as if often, at least, the whole thing got down to that, right? Most people are attracted by the concept that the Romans won because they had their own equipment. But if you ask them to explain the manipular system in its actual functionment, or where it stemmed from, for which reason, you start hearing the delirium. Because objectively, these things are not explained thoroughly and seriously and structurally and systematically and on the base of sources. And it all turns into like, no, it's just about, opening gaps in facts with Gladius and Pilum, and don't really explain how. It's at the individual fighter's level. And then you discover these people have not even studied those, 7 battles there are about, between the Roman Manipular Legion and the Hellenistic Macedonian phalanx from the sources. So what are we talking about in the first place? But anyhow, this is my usual ramble when I talk about this stuff. For now, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.